Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder, director, and curator of the Skyscraper Museum, and thank you for joining us tonight for the last of this year's book talks, talks that we do at least once a month, and how perfect that we conclude 2025 with the Empire State Building. And we're celebrating this new book. You see it on your screen, but you see it on my screen as well, by Glenn Kurtz, a writer who has spent, I think, nearly a decade or more in the pursuit of the biographies of the men at work, some of the craftsmen, some of the workers in the various building trades, uh, who were captured by the famous photographer Louis Hine, and became the focus of Glenn's quest to learn more about these men. And I will get off the screen pretty quickly, but I thought before I'll introduce Glenn, and then I'll return to some of the resources that the Skyscraper Museum has and has expanded upon over these last actually 20 years of the museum's history. So let me show you some of these slides, beginning first with an introduction of Glenn Kurtz, who is beaming to us from San Francisco tonight. He's somewhat warmer than we are in our freezing New York, but this was a good opportunity to be able to grab him early on in the life of his promotion of his book, because it's just been published in November. It's the second, actually the third of Glenn's books that you can see here on the screen, and you can find on his website and learn more about each one of them. But I'll just mention the 3 Minutes in Poland, which is a book that is very certainly different in its subject matter of Jews in Poland before the rise of the Nazis and the Holocaust, but is somewhat similar to the approach that he's taken at Men and Work, which is to find the biographies of this mostly lost, mostly tragically destroyed in the Holocaust, the lives of this small Polish shtetl. His book was made into a movie, a documentary, which won numerous awards, and you can learn more about those on his website. But that movie is called 3 Minutes, the name of this short 3-minute film that was captured by his grandfather as he traveled before World War II. That project is very much connected to the kind of deeply humanistic pursuit of Glenn's writing projects. So let me just continue to try to quickly dispense with the Skyscraper Museum's own focus on the Empire State Building so that Glenn can come and talk about his work. But more than 25 years ago, in 1998, we published this book, Building the Empire State, which was based on documents that we received from the legacy firm of Sterrett Brothers and Eakin, HRH Construction. In addition to the notebook that is the facsimile that was republished in Building the Empire State, there was a job book, and this is the page of the construction costs of the Empire State from Paul Sterrett's own record of all the individual items. In addition to the wonderful Sterrett book that we received from Sterrett Brothers and Eakin's legacy firm, there was also a family scrapbook that was put together by Paul Sterrett and someone within the firm, it's not clear who, but that as a result of our publishing the facsimile of Building the Empire State came to the museum through the descendants of the Sterretts. And this was the erection views of the Empire State Building that you can see here, as it was shown in one of our exhibitions in 10 Tops, with some of the pages as it was displayed in the case of the open pages of the notebook. But we've also put these pages in a digital format online on our website, and you can see pages of them here. A couple of examples of these more than 500 photographs of the work. Here is another grouping that focuses in particular on the building trades, but in general without naming the participants. And it's really Glenn's achievement that he finds the identities of at least some of these laborers and craftsmen who constructed the Empire State Building, some more than a dozen among the more than 3,400 men that were at work on the site. We put all of our photographs originally on our website, where they were available online for about 20 years in this interface that unfortunately was created in the software Flash. Flash is no longer supported on the internet anymore. And so we have been working in order to try to bring this project back into an online interactive accessibility. And this is what is on our website right now. So I just wanted to make sure that you know about that. But returning to Glenn, I'm going to ask him now to come on the screen as I leave. After his talk, I'll come back on the screen. We'll have a little bit of a conversation. So, Glenn, can you come on the screen now as I stop my share?
Well, thank you, Carol, and thank you, Dan. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. I was thinking, I've been a fan and a supporter of the Skyscraper Museum for probably most of its existence, and I was just remembering today that when it was still in a temporary space, was it in 40 Wall Street, just like in a corner of the lobby or something? And there may even have been an exhibit then about the Empire State Building. I remember going
14 Wall Street, right?
14 Wall Street,
Bankers
okay.
Trust Building. Mm-hmm.
Right. I remember going in there, and you had one of the rivet guns sort of leaning against the wall, the kind that they used to construct the Empire State Building.
And we still have it.
And you still have it. Yeah, it's called a cricket.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when nobody was looking, I snuck a grab and I picked it up to see how heavy it was and what it felt like to hold one. So I feel like I should apologize to you for that now. I should also apologize to everyone who has joined us this evening. Today, they decided to start tearing the roof off of the building next door to mine. So if you hear any background construction noise, it's not the soundtrack that I put on, and it's not me conjuring spirits of the workers. It's unfortunately the annoying reality of people working next door. So I apologize for that. And finally, yeah, I should say I'm a little bit humbled and even embarrassed to be speaking here about the Empire State Building, since undoubtedly, beginning with Carol, there are many people here who know a great deal more about the Empire State Building, its construction and its history than I do. My project and the sort of parameters of the kind of the experiment that I set up for myself was to think a little bit more about how the building is seen. This is what happens when you let a writer or a literary person at loose in art history and architectural history archives. I pay a great deal of attention to what people say, how they say it, and what the implications are for that, and above all, for how we interpret and make sense of the artifacts that exist, and why, in a sort of larger cultural sense, those interpretations seem to make sense to us. So, for example, if you walk into the lobby of the Empire State Building today, I see that there's a structural narrative, a sort of symbolic narrative that's kind of built into the architecture. The very first thing that you see if you walk into the building is this 2-story tall depiction of the building itself in this cathedral-like space. And that's a phrase that was used by the architects, that it was cathedral-like. And when I hear that, I think they mean cathedral. So if we think of this as sort of a symbolic space dedicated to a kind of worship, the central object is clearly the building itself. And the building here is, as you see, depicted in this beautiful stainless steel wall relief superimposed on a marble map of New England, which includes some of the Atlantic Ocean. the peak of the building kind of pierces the sun and unleashes these beautiful rays, which extend out across the whole map. If you can see the floor, you have these beautiful marble chevrons, 3 rows of them, which are sort of like, I think of them as like strobing arrows set in stone, which lead you towards this depiction. And then on the ceiling, the magnificent mural, which if you haven't seen it, next time you go into the building, you should certainly look up. It's this wonderful Art Deco Milky Way of stars and planets and gears, incongruously, which sort of serves as the context for this building. I think it's not going too far to say that the building is conceived of in this architectural space as not only the center of New York, which it New England, presumably of the country. And indeed, if we think about that ceiling mural, it's kind of like the center of the universe. In any case, the building itself is conceived of in this symbolic and I would almost say mythological sense as something profoundly important. And of course, we know one of the things that it stands for is the rise of modern America and the power of modern America. And I think what's most important to me, and as I said, the parameters of the experiment that I undertook was to think about how that conception of the building tends to shape how we understand the artifacts and how that support the history of the building, and also how we understand and interpret this when we look at them, these artifacts about the building. So it's what I call there's a sort of mythological dimension, or perhaps less grandiose, there's a corporate dimension. We think on the largest scale. So it wouldn't at all be surprising, I think, if I were to ask any of you in the audience who built the Empire State Building, to come up with the answer, Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon, of course, the architects. If you know a little more about the construction history, it wouldn't at all be incorrect or unusual to say Starrett Brothers and Eakin, who were the general contractors. If, as Carol has done, you explore the financial and business history of the project, you might come up with John Jacob Raskob, Luigi Kaufman, Pierre S. DuPont, and some of the other gentlemen who provided the funds for the building. And if you ask, well, what about the men? What about the workers? What you'll come up with, once again, I think in a sort of mythological sense, for some reason, my screen, there we go. You'll come up with these magnificent photos that we all know of Louis Hine, and probably this one is the most famous one. And Hine himself participated, I think, in this mythological sort of a perspective on the building, this corporate and generalized symbolic view of the building. So he entitled this magnificent photograph "The Sky Boy," although originally he called it Icarus. Again, a mythological reference, though slightly a logical one, considering that Icarus plummeted into the sea. But the idea that we would think about who this man was, I think does not come into question when we think about the building on this, what I call the corporate level. And in fact, the interpretations of this photograph from the more or less the moment it was first published in the sociological journal Survey Graphic in January of 1931, was to dissociate it from the specifics of the man's job or the man's act, and to think of it more as a symbol of America rising, very much as the building itself. So that attitude has continued until this day. And so in 2016, you can find a description of this photograph from Alexander Nemerov, who's examining Hine's photographs. And he can write, "An adventurous lad, the sky boy sets out alone on a journey like no one else's. Free of constraints, of real world requirements and obligations, he floats in some area of private exploration, the biographical ideal of the sovereign self in full flight, lifted like Lindbergh in ecstatic solitude." I won't comment extensively on this, only to indicate that it bears no reference whatsoever to what the man is doing, why he's there, who he is, or what purpose his act might serve in the context of constructing a building. So this attitude of sort of mythologizing the images of the Empire State Building, it actually begins with Louis Hine. He himself thought of these images in these larger sociological terms. He's born in 1874 in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. He goes to school there where he meets Frank Manny, who was a progressive pedagogue and a student of the educational philosopher John Dewey. In 1901, Frank Manny becomes the superintendent of the School for Ethical Culture in New York City, run by Felix Adler. And he invites Hine to become a member of the faculty, which Hine does. And in fact, it was in the context of learning to use photography as a pedagogical tool that Hine begins to be a photographer. And his very first sort of great body of work, his photographs of immigrants at Ellis Island, were actually taken on what were school field trips. But it's very characteristic of Hine, who then went on to get a master's in education and to become a sociologist involved with the Survey Graphic and their staff photographer, to think of his photographs as conveying an idea, conveying a larger sociological truth. And this is true even when we get to the Empire State Building. So his famous images, which he publishes first independently in 1932 in his wonderful book, Men at Work. Here as well, you can see that the Sky Boy, this is where that image gets its now famous name. He conceives of these images as conveying something more than just men doing a job, but rather men embodying something that was greater than anything that they might do. In his preface to the book, which he titles The Spirit of the Industry, he says that, yes, we may call this the machine age, but what matters is not the machine, but the brains and brawn of the men who operate it. And that the most important thing was not what they could achieve with these machines, but the expression of the human spirit that they represented. So I'm sure that you're familiar with many of these photographs, which are quite dramatic and quite striking. And many of them, particularly the second one from the left of the ironworkers standing on the beams and cut off shorts and shirtless, have become quite world famous as sort of these embodiments of America during the onset of the Great Depression at the end of the 20s and 30s, the sort of grit and determination of, as Hine said, the human spirit, in this case, the American spirit. So it was not at all uncommon for interpreters of these images to pursue this symbolic dimension. So we'll have a description from Freddie Langer, some stand describing these images in his book of these images. Some stand with steel cables in hand, pulling them taut as though, whoops, sorry, the screen is covering my, my screen. Pulling them taut as though they could as they were holding the globe in place. Others grapple with wrenches so large they look as though they could set the clockwork of the Earth's orbit in motion, while engineers using surveying equipment peer into the future. If you look at Hine's book and the layout of the book here as well, he tends to generalize the men and conceive of them in a symbolic sense. So here's the first page of his book, and he shows the workers drilling what would be the foundations for the Empire State Building, and he entitles it Foundation Men. So an image like this, once again, will be interpreted in this larger symbolic sense. The nameless and therefore abstract foundation man was not only digging the foundation of a building, his virtue assured the foundation of American society in such uncertain times. the, the parameters of my experiment which was to try to begin to look at the building not from this corporate perspective, but to look at these images not as symbols, but rather as documentation of individuals, made me realize that these interpretations were not just factual misrepresentations of history and of Hine, but very much of what we're actually seeing in the photograph. If you look at Hine's own caption for this photo, he says, "Foundation men, they work in a haze of dust, of rock dust, which they know will shorten their lives. The man above received an award for craftsmanship." And I think this is maybe the first example of how the perspective with which you view these images shapes what you imagine them to contain, and even what you see and read, how you understand what you read. From the corporate perspective, I think this idea that he received an award for craftsmanship is kind of a generalized idea. He's somehow a superior worker, and he received an award. But in point of fact, if you go into the lobby of the Empire State Building, about 10 feet to the right of the giant stainless steel depiction of the building, there is a plaque on the wall, rather inconspicuously mounted, as you see here above a radiator grill, and now behind a sign which warns you not to approach it. And this plaque has the names of 32 men who won Empire State Craftsmanship Awards. So, in fact, even in 1931 or 32, when Hine's book came out, it was a pretty straightforward question of, if the man in the photograph won an award for craftsmanship, perhaps his name is here on this plaque. And in fact, Hine, on the back of his photograph of the plaque, rather helpfully included this note: "See also photos of men." Again, you might read that as a generalized symbolic statement. You should see pictures of the men. But in fact, it means look at the pictures of the men who won these awards. This man is not anonymous. His name was Michael Tierney, and he was a rock driller on the Empire State Building. Well, what can we do with that information? It happens in the case of Michael Tierney not very much. If you look at the 1930 census, there was a gentleman named Michael Tierney living in a boarding house on 96th Street, a 37-year-old immigrant from Ireland who arrived in the US in 1909. His profession he lists as laborer for the construction industry, which is certainly not enough to identify him clearly as the man in this photograph, though it does distinguish him from the 77 other Michael Tierneys who lived in Manhattan and who appear in the 1930 census. If you go to the Ellis Island database, only one Michael Tierney arrived in 1909. On September 22nd, a 21-year-old single man arrived from Cootehill, Ireland. Well, that's a discrepancy because his age would be different than it lists in the census. Not an uncommon discrepancy when you go into these kinds of public records, but still casting doubt on whether I've actually found the right men. But I want to pause here for just a moment and consider this, because I think that there is a world of difference between claiming that he is anonymous and indeed basing your theoretical structure of your interpretation on the fact of his anonymity, and saying that he was a man about whom we don't know very much. The difference is, I would say, highlights this difference in perspective between taking the corporate view, which almost requires that the men be anonymous, and taking what I'm calling the perspective of the workers, or the scale of the individual, as our attitude towards these images. On the scale of the individual, there's a space for this man to have lived and had a specific life. Whereas on the scale of the corporation, he serves only as a symbol of the mammoth project. And if you go back into Hine's archives, you'll find that the majority of the portraits that he took of Empire State workers are indeed portraits of the winners of the Craftsmanship Awards. So although I have not been able to identify all of them, I have identified the majority of them. Hine's job was quite explicitly to take portraits of the winners of the Craftsmanship Awards. He may have been hired because he was a great photographer. I suspect more likely he was hired as a work for hire job, and the fact that his photographs turned out to be masterpieces was entirely incidental and had little to do with the reasons why he was ultimately hired. Well, it's worth noting a little bit about these craftsmanship awards since there is no record whatsoever of all of the workmen who built the Empire State Building, despite very self-consciously being an important project and the world's tallest building, and great deal of documentation being created about the team that built it, the managerial team that built it. There is no record of the men who did the construction, so that the Craftsmanship Award plaque is itself quite a remarkable thing. It is by far the majority of names that we can recover of workmen who built the building. So the award was not given out by Empire State Incorporated or the Empire State Building, despite what it says on the plaque. It was awarded by the New York Building Congress. So again, probably some of you know more about the New York Building Congress than I do, but just as a brief summary, it was founded in 1921 as a consortium of architects, builders, material suppliers, and others in the construction industry to bring forward from the coordination that was somewhat imposed by the government during World War I in the construction industry. Construction industry, as you probably know, had a rather fraught first decade of the 20th century, great number of strikes, and a lot of unrest in the relationship between management and labor. During the war, that was suppressed to a great extent, and coordination was directed from above. And the employers who participated in that, among them William Starrett, found this to be a vast improvement in the conditions of the construction industry. They wanted to bring that into peacetime. And so the New York Building Congress was in some sense founded to try to replicate those conditions again. Among other things, they established relations with, of course, all of the trade unions whom they employed. And one of the gestures that they made to those trade unions was the creation of these craftsmanship awards. That was in 1925. And the chairman of the Congress's Committee on the Recognition of Craftsmanship was architect William Orr Ludlow. He served in that capacity for 15 years. He, among many other projects, is credited with the original New York Times building. But Ludlow also, as a product very much of the same progressive sensibility that Louis Hine was part of, and also an adherent to the craftsmanship ideal as sort of established in the arts and crafts movement, did not see his award as being specifically to recognize the physical labor and skill of the workmen. He saw it much more as a form of sociological uplift, moral uplift. And the idea was that the award would not just recognize men, but it would provide an ideal that would improve them morally. And he wrote in 1929, "It's most desirable to put the whole matter where it deserves to be placed, on the high plane of great and splendid service, not only to the building industry, but to every individual concerned. For the stirring of ambition to do nothing but a high grade of work ennobles a man's whole life, brings him a contentment he has not known before, makes him a man of finer ideals, and in a word, does something to create a better citizenship, as well as a far worthier nation." So once again, I would say that this award, at least in its conception by Ludlow, had this symbolic purpose that although it was intended to recognize individual men, its recognition of them was representative and symbolic. The purpose of the award was not really to recognize the individual, but to provide for the workforce this ideal of good service. Winners of the award received a certificate, a 15 by 21 inch framed certificate signed by members of the Building Congress, and they also became honorary members of the Building Congress, so non-dues paying and also non-voting members. They also received a gold lapel pin. And fun fact, the winners for the Empire State Building, the gold lapel pin gave them lifetime free access to the observation deck. Well, these awards received a great deal of attention, but once again, this is just to differentiate the approach that I'm trying to take to this material, this well-combed material, from how it has been traditionally handled. The awards were publicized quite widely, not only for the Empire State Building, but for all of the other buildings on which they were awarded. And by the time the winners at the Empire State Building were named, in two ceremonies, one in October of 1930 and for the structural trades, and then another one in February of 1931 for the finishing trades. There were 1,900 other winners by the time the Empire State Building winners were named. But here you see, again, in the newspaper coverage, although the title is Craftsmen Rewarded, the only people named in the imagery are the prominent men who are granting the award, not the ordinary men who are receiving it. Even though it is ostensibly to recognize them. And it was the burden of my research to try to rectify that. So you see here on the right, it has been possible to give names to most of the men who appear in this photograph, in addition to Lieutenant Governor Lehman and former Governor Al Smith. So I'm just going to take a little diversion here from the body of my research into the winners of the Craftsmanship Awards to talk a little bit about the materials that are here at the Skyscraper Museum, because they were so instrumental and crucial to my search. And also they're just such wonderful resources. So an almost identical photograph to the one that appears in the newspaper is contained in the scrapbook album that Carol mentioned at the beginning. And it rather remarkably includes the name of the man who is here shaking Lieutenant Governor Lehman's hand, Tom Walsh, Thomas Francis Walsh, who was a hoisting engineer whose name is on the plaque in the lobby. That scrapbook is a really remarkable document. And again, I use this term, the corporate perspective, and not in any pejorative sense, but rather to distinguish the scale of attention. And for the corporate perspective, which tends to name owners of companies only, the scrapbook itself is quite extraordinary in how deep in the hierarchy it goes in naming individuals who contributed to the project. So here you'll see, among others, the field distribution checkers, as well as the field engineers, and one of the only women whose name can be recovered who contributed to the building. This is the nurse, Miss C. Lynch, about whom I could discover no further information. But as a diligent researcher and a responsible researcher, I hope, at least, it's important to make certain that the information that you're receiving, even from this extraordinary and unique primary source, is accurate. So here, for example, we have the field engineers. And this is an exceptionally helpful, useful, and historically significant object. Among other things, it allows us to identify several of the men who appear in Hine's photographs. It also, for that very reason, elucidates something of Hine's practice, because you see him here photographing several men in more or less exactly the same pose, same position in the top two photographs. And you can see Hine himself working to, in a sense, capture an idea. But it's possible to give these men their names back and identify them as specifically as contributors to the building of the Empire State Building. Except, as it turns out, there are many, many errors in the labeling of the scrapbook. And if my screen will, there we go. It turns out that Orville Keyes, K-E-Y-E-S, is not in fact K-E-Y-E-S, but K-E-A-Y-S. There was no information whatsoever about Orville Keyes spelled the first way, but suddenly when you find the correct spelling to his name, an entire history leaks out of the archives. And in this instance, which I must credit my sister with discovering since I had given up, but she's a much more talented genealogist than I am. In this instance, the Department of Labor Certificate of Arrival contains a photograph, which allows us to be completely certain that the man is in fact who we say he is. So Orville Keyes, he was 24 years old when this photograph was taken. He was an immigrant from Canada, born in Manitoba, arrived in 1915 with his mother. And much more detail about his life comes out if you follow the documentation. Well, again, to differentiate the perspective that I'm trying to take, this misspelling of his name is a perfectly trivial matter on the level of the corporate archive. It's a clerical error in what was, after all, an in-house or private object. Looked at, however, from the perspective of the individual men, it is itself the threshold between recognition and anonymity, or obscurity, if not exactly anonymity. So this misspelling, again, from the perspective of the men, is something of tremendous importance. Other pages in the scrapbook have similar problems, as well as offer similar remarkable funds of information. So one interesting issue on this particular page, in the top photograph, we see someone named Dick McCarthy and John Lohman. On the right side, we see another person named Sluke Ryerson and also John Lohman. However, the two John Lohmans are quite clearly not the same person. That was a discrepancy I was not able to resolve. Certainly possible there were two John Lohmans. It's also possible, and given the amount of clerical, I hate to say, but sloppiness that one finds in this documentation, it seems just as possible that the person who was writing the captions either was unfamiliar with these people or simply got confused and made an error. And in fact, my research will indicate that the Craftsmanship Award plaque itself may contain errors in the men's names. But at the same time, Sluke Ryerson appears in a very famous photograph by Lewis Hine, along with another man who's identified on this page, Oscar Johnson. I was able to independently corroborate both of those identities. They are named by other people, in particular a man named Harold McLean, who was an iron worker and was interviewed in Nina Rosenblum's wonderful film, America and Lewis Hine. And the correspondence he had with her, he annotated Hine's book, Men at Work, and spoke specifically of Oscar Johnson, who was the boss of his Derrick gang. And Sluke Ryerson was the bolt boss, so the bolting up boss. It happens that they were the directors of what was called the Central or the Tower Derrick gang, which was the only derrick that proceeded from the foundations up through the completion of the 86-story structure and then went on to build the mooring mast. And this is a photograph of that gang, again, with Sluke Ryerson in the right identified and Oscar Johnson, the boss of the Derrick gang, there on the lower left. Several other men can be identified in this photograph. Unfortunately, the Getty Images identification tag obscures the face of Harold McLean, who provided the corroborating information. But other men in this photograph I've been able to identify. If we go back to the other photograph, and this is the last one that I'll talk about, that shows Dick McCarthy with John Lohman. Dick McCarthy, also someone who Lewis Hine made quite famous photographs of this gentleman here on the right. You see him. Hine also on the back of these photographs very helpfully wrote the man's name. He appears to have worked also with his brother, James, and I have information about both of them. And that's a very significant identification, I suspect. And this is where I will sort of show the limits of my approach, which often have to depend upon, my identifications have to depend on very circumstantial evidence, though sometimes it's tight, other times it's somewhat looser. But Hine himself, on the back of one of these portraits of Dick McCarthy, wrote this note: one of the Sky Boys on Empire State with a long record of big buildings he has worked. And this is intriguing because if you put them side by side, Dick McCarthy bears an extraordinary resemblance to the man who appears in the photograph called the Sky Boy or Icarus. There's probably no way to confirm whether or not it's true, but it's an intriguing possibility to identify this man in what is undoubtedly the most famous photograph of the Empire State Building's construction, taken by Louis Hine. Well, what happens if it's possible to identify an individual? The whole purpose of my project was not to demystify or demythologize the building. Certainly everyone who loves it, myself included, has this reverence, this somewhat religious reverence, as the lobby architecture would imply, for the building and for the artifacts associated with it and the process of its construction. However, as mythological figures, these men become available to any kind of interpretation, both good or bad. And in the 1930s, they were held up as heroes, and embodied the spirit of America, or in Hine's sense, the spirit of industry, even the human spirit. More recently, they are being used, for example, by the senior aide to the White House, Stephen Miller, as examples of real Americans as opposed to not real Americans. And he claims, with absolutely no evidence, to know the immigration history of each of these men. So the purpose of recognizing them as individuals is precisely to combat this caricature, whether good or bad, the cliches and caricatures that attend on any mythological interpretation of the men. It's not that I wish to discount the mythology or in any way undermine it. On the contrary, my point is, yes, indeed, these men were heroes, and most of them were immigrants, some of them even illegal. And yet what makes the building so extraordinary is that this extraordinary building was built precisely by these very ordinary men. And to me, that is what makes it a fitting symbol for America. So thank you very much. I'm happy to talk now with Carol.
Well, thank you, Glenn. Your research is very impressive, and I'm so thrilled to see the way that the scrapbook offered you both leads and frustrations. I'm glad about the leads. And I'm very glad you pursued them, because we never pursued them ourselves. We were, much more interested in the process of construction, the Sterrett brothers' role, which is a truly heroic accomplishment. The work that they did was brain work with a manual dimension to it that brought kind of the mind and the hand together in a way that had not been accomplished in any other building project, at least in skyscrapers in New York, but maybe equaled only with Hoover Dam or the Panama Canal. I mean, these marshaling of armies of men, as William Sterrett, the younger brother of the Sterrett brothers, put it in his book, Skyscrapers, and the Men who built them. So it's so fascinating to see the way you pursued these individuals' identities and then their genealogy as well, their biography as much as you could reconstruct it. And that's the reason for people, was one of the reasons for people to buy the book. But the only place that you can find this information is in Glenn's new book. I wonder if you might fill in a little bit more about how Louis Hine received the commission. I know you talk about it in the book, and I think I would put it, to my mind, a caveat in the way that you discuss the corporate motive, because certainly PR, the public relations, and the press image and identity of and presence of the Empire State Building in media around the world was something that had a profit motive behind it, but it also had pride that was motivating it. So, but it was a corporate strategy.
Sure. Yeah, and that's very much the case. Again, uh, many of the interpretations of Hine, I think, are somewhat fanciful, and because it turned out that he was such a great artist and that his images are themselves such great art, that tended to influence how people imagined his presence at the site. They assumed that he was hired because he was a great artist. I don't think that that was the case. People have proposed any number of different ways that he originally got the commission, whether it was from John Jacob Rascob or because he happens to live in the same New York suburb as Richmond Shreve, one of the architects, as well as a couple of the other men involved in the building. I don't think that that was the case. And again, this is one of those circumstantial cases that I try to build. But Hine was closely connected to this sort of sociological movement, this progressive sociological movement from the early part of the century, as I mentioned, as was a woman named Belle Moskowitz, who is nowadays not very well known, but should be, and was one of ultimately the most powerful women politically in the country in the 1920s and 30s. She became personal secretary to Alfred E. Smith, who was four-term governor of New York State and became president of Empire State Incorporated. Al Smith ran for president in 1928, lost in a landslide to Herbert Hoover. Belle Moskowitz was his campaign manager. And she is credited, I think rightly, with all of the details of Al Smith's progressive agenda as governor of New York. She was the brains behind the scene who put together his programs and then sold them both legislatively, but also in terms of public relations. And she was a genius public relations. So when Al Smith became president of Empire State Incorporated, Belle Moskowitz became director of publicity for Empire State Incorporated. And I think that she and Hine were both involved in the Survey Graphic as early as 1906. She writes an article called "The Way of the Girl," which is illustrated by photographs by Hine. So I suspect that they had known each other for 20 years or longer by the time the Empire State Building is built. And she reached out to him, knowing that he was, work for hire. He was a freelance photographer. He needed a gig. And I suspect that she hired him because of their longstanding connection.
And one other aspect of the presentation of the Hine's photographs to the public was in the windows of the building as it opened. I wonder if you might talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, it was. I mean, I think, however, for whatever reason she hired him, Belle Moskowitz was sensitive enough to recognize that these were magnificent photographs and that they served as magnificent photographs the purposes of publicizing the building and creating its image and its aura. So it may be because rentals were very, very slow in 1931 when the building opened and they hadn't yet rented the space. But for a couple of months, right around the opening of the building in May, June, July of 1931, the corner of 33rd Street and Fifth Avenue, those corner windows were turned into a photo gallery in which many of Hine's photographs were displayed. And there's a picture in my book of the crowds standing in front of those windows admiring these photographs. So just to go back to the point that you made before, I think a lot of the interpretation that we have of Hine's images is in some sense really an interpretation of the publicity usage that they were put to by Bell Moskowitz.
Another writer who highlighted Bell Moskowitz is Robert Caro in The Power Broker. There's quite a lot about her. And certainly another key figure, Al Smith, is someone who is always identified with the working class. So I wonder if you might talk about that, because as president of the Empire State Building Corporation and the person responsible for kind of projecting its media image, as well as overseeing the dollars and cents in the balance sheets, which were not looking good for so much of the first decade and more of the building's operation. There are, by the way, wonderful documents, wonderful archives at the Hagley Museum and Library, and there at it's actually in the John Jacob Rascod papers. So it's a archive that's dedicated to business history. There are documents of the rent rolls and the red ink in the graphs about the gap between the costs and the revenues in those first years. But to your point about the symbolic identity of or projection of, or maybe the perception of some critics taking a symbolic message from the photographs or waxing poetic. It was a little bit of a period piece at the time. I mean, I think it's common at the time to think about the common man, after all, as the America slips into the Great Depression. That idea, the kind of Frank Capra idea of American workers and the everyman, is very much a part of the culture. So could you talk a little bit about that in terms of, let's say, the zeitgeist, but also specifically about Al Smith and how he identified with working class?
Sure. Yeah. Well, if you had asked anybody in the late 20s, 29 or 30, who built the Empire State Building, the answer would have been Al Smith, without question. It was considered his building. And in many of the newspaper captions, the workers are called Smith workers. And Al Big Shanty was one of the nicknames of the building. So Al Smith was very much the public face of the building. And it was an absolute, it was a genius job for him. He was one of the most recognized, most respected and admired politicians in the New York or the East Coast, let's say. I think his appeal was more regional than he would have needed to succeed as a presidential candidate. But he was also Roman Catholic, which he was the first Roman Catholic to be on a major presidential ticket. And he had come up from nothing. He had been, a scrappy street kid who worked at the Fulton Fish Market. He would famously say that was the university he graduated from, Fulton Fish Market, and went on to become governor of New York and then president of Empire State Incorporated. And the joke at the time was that even though he lost the presidential race, still he occupied the highest office in the land, because his office was at the top of the building. Same thing with John Jacob Rascod, who started out as a scrappy kid, shining shoes, ended up as Pierre S. DuPont's personal secretary, and then the financial mastermind behind the growth of General Motors, became one of the richest men in the country. So this idea of the sort of Horatio Alger rags to riches story is baked into both of these men, who were figureheads for the building. So that's, and Al Smith's, sort of political image was as a man who was sympathetic to the working class and immigrants. And it was not inaccurate, although from the time of the Empire State Building's opening until his death, he became progressively more embittered and politically conservative. He started to feud with Roosevelt, whom he felt was taking over much of his progressive legislation, which had been implemented in New York State, and now nationalizing it, but without crediting Smith for its inception. And he became a great opponent of Roosevelt's. So, yeah, he was the perfect figurehead for this publicity campaign to highlight the strengths of the common man. And to close, I just wanted to say, but the very idea of the common man is itself already mythological, right? It's not saying, oh, we're going to talk about these individuals and their actual lives. It's we're going to generalize about what we imagine the virtues of that, class or whatever that figure to be. And again, if you go in and look at the actual lives of these actual common men who built the building, they don't often correspond to the Frank Capra image that we have of that.
I don't know the answer to this angle of analyzing Al Smith's whether not motivation, but role in instigating the Hine publicity campaign. Let's call it that. And perhaps you have a way of evaluating that better in terms of Belle Moskowitz. She and Al Smith were so close, as you say, they might have been one of the same mind. But do you have any thoughts or research about what role Al Smith had in vetoing or directing the direction of the messaging of the building?
I don't have a lot of information about that. I don't think there is a lot of information about that to be had. What I found was that he left it to Belle Moskowitz to take care of. He wrote a lovely letter to Hine. So for a year before the announcement of the Craftsmanship Awards and the installation of that plaque in the lobby, Al Smith was making speeches saying that we intend to put a plaque down in the lobby to recognize these workers. He was really talking it up. And of course, he was at both of the ceremonies in October 30 and February of 31, shook the hands of all of these men, signed their certificates. Then in the in this letter that he wrote to Hine, when the photographs were on display in the lobby of the Empire State Building, he compliments him on taking these fine photographs of the ordinary workmen, with no indication that he recognized that these ordinary workmen were men he himself had met and shaken their hands. So my suspicion is that it was a little bit below his threshold of visibility. He didn't really pay attention to it. That's my guess. Whereas Belle Moskowitz was exceptionally detail oriented, and she would have known precisely what she was doing and who who these people were.
We have one question that I'm going to ask as we reach 7 o'clock. That there are a couple of questions, but they both are kind of closely query about the steel workers, which is kind of everybody's favorite aspect of the construction history. But let me just read this one, which is a little bit long, but I think it's easier if I just read Professor Evans' question to you, asking, as the poetic quotes about the Skyboy in particular showcase the heroic and contributory work of the builders, they also imply an imposition of this elusive portrayal of the workers. Are there, and here's a good question for you in order to show just how dedicated your research is compared to what is available. Are there archives of workers or craftsmen speaking of their unique experiences in their own words? And do you know if the Skyboy, or specifically Icarus, survived the construction, or was he one of the workers that perished? Let's emphasize that. Are there archives of the workers or craftsmen speaking in their own words?
Well, there are no archives dedicated to the workers on the Empire State Building. That's unfortunately much too specific.
That I know.
That I know of, yes. and you and I have discussed this in the past, the information just isn't there. There are, however, labor archives at NYU. Robert Wagner and Tenement Archive has a large oral history collection of workers speaking about their lives and their jobs. I was unable to find anyone in that archive who had participated in the Empire State Building. That doesn't mean no one there did. It only means they didn't mention it. Because another thing that's, I think, worth mentioning, that from the corporate perspective, a worker who worked on the Empire State Building already, that's some kind of an extraordinary badge of honor and deserving of a kind of, heroic treatment. For the workers itself, it was a job among jobs. Like, it was one job that they did in a lifetime of jobs. And the descendants whom I spoke with, they often rather disappointedly said, yeah, they never spoke about it. They never mentioned it. To them, it wasn't the big deal that it is to us, or that it was to the descendants. So yeah, it's possible that there is information about some of these workers that I wasn't able to identify. I'm sure there's an enormous amount of information out there that I wasn't able to grasp that would contribute to a greater definition of some of these men. To answer the question about the casualties, I know about Dick McCarthy's life. I think it was 1977. I think he died in 1977, lived in Brooklyn the rest of his life. But there's some controversy about the number of people who were killed. It's also a question that's frequently asked. Starrett Brothers and Ekin issued a letter in November of 1930 saying that 5 men were killed. And that number became somewhat canonical. It's not accurate. There was another death after that letter was published, and then another death, which is somewhat controversial since it was listed as a suicide. It was classed as a suicide, although the person who died had been a worker on the building, or possibly still was. It's somewhat unclear based upon the newspaper accounts. And then something that never gets mentioned is that there was one innocent passerby who was killed by falling debris, a woman named Elizabeth Eager. So the way in which we ask that question, how many men were killed building the Empire State Building, is itself already a leading question, because I would say that there were 7 men killed and 1 woman.
Mm-hmm. Back 25 years ago, when we was starting the museum, and we received the loan of an object that we still have here at the museum, the Riveter's Forge, the cricket, the catcher's can, and a large number of kind of assorted tools of a riveting team. It was the loan and then the gift of an iron worker active in New York. As I recall, his name is Steve Heller, and he corroborated, or he expressed the same view that you just did now, that it's every job is a job, a kind of river that's flowing in the life of every laborer, every craftsman on the job, every union member, and the workers in the building trades they're in the present in the job, but they don't celebrate their award, or they don't think about an award, I think, until maybe somebody is going to bestow one on them, and then they wonder why they didn't get it or somebody else did. And so those awards were a window. They were a hook on which you could begin to enter the research and to reconstruct some of these identities. You didn't talk too much. You did mention how the 77 Tim Walsh's, or there were,
yeah,
I think,
Michael Tierney's, yeah, even more Tom Walsh's.
Yeah, right. That so they're not anonymous. They're multitudinous in a way. There's just too many of them in order to know how to find an individual identity within this kind of flow of 3,500 men at work on the site during the peak of construction. So I think it's interesting that you heard the story, even with your own kind of driven interest in somehow reconstructing these individual identities, and to make every man into a specific person with a life and a biography and relatives and a history and all of that, which is fascinating, because any individual life is fascinating when you draw out details, and when you can find the thing that makes it remarkable and differentiates it from others. But there is this tension between the commonality of the experience of the building workers and the common man and the identity of the individual that I've experienced in my very limited discussion with the workers, and which, from my perspective as a historian interested in the kind of a middle range of picture, not the big symbolic picture and not the tiny little details, but something as an explanation of how things work together. It's that kind of in that middle zone that I place my interest in systemic and kind of organizational matters. So it was very interesting to our exhibitions and our research and our archive to try to put the idea of organizing the work, and then the men who were responsible for that aspect of it, who could be easily identified, but were largely unheralded in our day, if not at the time. They were well known, but every aspect of the history of the Empire State Building, I think, is interesting, and we can all find stories. And so I will hold your book up here, which is available in multiple copies at the Skyscraper Museum, but I'm sure you can find it on Amazon or any good bookstore. If you find it online, but try to go to a bookstore and buy it, and you'll be able to find in much greater detail than we could touch on tonight the kinds of deep research and deep thought and interest and passion that Glenn has brought to this project. So thank you, Glenn, for joining us from San Francisco, and here in New York. We'll light up the Empire State Building for you tonight.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I always enjoy talking with you about this building.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. What better way to end 2025 than with the Empire State Building? Okay, bye, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.